On the morning of October 7th, Palestinian militants from the terrorist group Hamas
launched a war against Israel, calling it al-Aqsa Flood. Initially, thousands of rockets were fired at Israel, and then militants began penetrating the southern part of the country by sea, land, and air. Terrorists on hang gliders were shooting at all civilians and military personnel they could reach.
On the first day of the attack, hundreds of civilians were killed, and similarly, hundreds were taken captive.
All those captured were taken to the Gaza Strip.
Whether they're alive is a big question.
Carried out this attack because of Israel's long blockade of Gaza, the occupation of Palestinian lands, and alleged crimes against Muslims, including the desecration of the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem.
What you just heard is the official explanation for the attack from the terrorists themselves, but we are interested not in the reason, but in the fact, as this is the largest and deadliest attack on Israeli territory indicates.
For example, Bloomberg journalists wrote that this is the biggest failure of Israeli intelligence in the last 50 years. In addition, the US stated that they had no knowledge of the terrorists preparing an attack on their ally. But it's not that simple, because CNN news journalists, citing their sources,
reported that Pentagon intelligence knew about the preparation for the attack and even had enough time to warn the Israelis.
It is absolutely unprecedented for a terrorist organization to have the capability or means to carry out coordinated simultaneous attacks from air, sea, and land.
In this video, I will tell you about the terrorist group Hamas.
Who are they, and why did they appear in the first place? What do Hamas militants fight for and demand? How did they transform from a small group into one of the most powerful players in the region? Where do they get their money? Who supports them? What could be the consequences of another Palestinian-Israeli confrontation?
I will start this story with the first Palestinian Intifada, the great uprising of Palestinian Arabs that began in 1987.
Massive demonstrations, clashes with Israelis, and internal conflicts claimed the lives of a little more than 2,000 people. The reason for those uprisings was the declaration of the struggle against the Israeli occupation of territories taken under control as a result of the Six-Day War.
Although Israel returned most of those lands in exchange for peace, but the radicalized Palestinians were no longer concerned.
The end date of the First Intifada can be considered September 1993, when Israel on one side and the PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization, on the other, signed a peace treaty. This Oslo agreement was supposed to lay the foundation for the emergence of a Palestinian state alongside Israel, but
as we clearly see today, this didn't happen, and it didn't in part because various terrorist organizations and groups interfered. They didn't want to coexist with Israelis at all.
Eventually, this internal conflict led to a split in the Palestinian movement. There was the PLO, led by Yasser Arafat, who, despite being radicals, were willing to negotiate with Israel. During the Intifada, Hamas emerged, openly declaring that they did not recognize Israel as a state, unlike the PLO.
Hamas, while not recognizing the statehood of their neighbor, accepted the Palestinian state within the 1967 borders. A strange paradox.
It's not enough to have a state on the West Bank and in Gaza. The best solution is to allow all Christians, Jews, and Muslims to live in Palestine in an Islamic state.
And what to do with those who don't want to accept such a scenario? The answer is simple: destroy them. This is why Hamas not only began to develop rapidly, but also became a political party.
Because in 1988, shortly after the start of the first Palestinian Intifada, the world was already warned that it was impossible to eliminate radical movements and terrorist organizations in one fell swoop. Moreover, such an attempt could lead to even greater violence. Therefore, instead of large-scale confrontations, other options had to be sought. When consensus is insufficient, fundamentalists may prevail. If historical changes do not occur soon, everything will shift towards even greater violence, giving radicals the advantage.
This advantage is called the Gaza Strip. This seemingly small dot on the map conceals enormous power that doesn't always have good intentions.
This small territory is 41 kilometers long and only 10 kilometers wide. It is located between Israel, Egypt, and the Mediterranean Sea.
Initially, the Gaza Strip was occupied by Egypt. Israel captured it during the 1967 war. Along with Gaza, Israel also annexed the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights.
But Israel withdrew its troops and settlers from the Gaza Strip in 2005, unilaterally leaving in exchange for peace, but more on that later. Overall, over 2 million people live in Gaza today, and its population density is one of the highest in the world. According to the UN, more than half of Gaza's population, or 75%, are registered refugees. In numbers, that's 1.7 million people, with over 500,000 of them living in 8 overcrowded camps scattered across the Strip. That's the super short version. It was in Gaza in 1987 that Hamas emerged, a branch of the Egyptian organization Muslim Brotherhood. Their ideology initially stood on 3 pillars, if you will: religion, charity, strange as it may sound, and the fight against Israel.
Also, the first enemies of Hamas were internal Palestinians.
For example, Yasser Arafat and the Fatah Party. We'll talk about that later as well. One of the key founders and spiritual leader, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, led all this. His views were uncompromising, and so were those of his followers. In Hamas's founding charter, it is clearly stated that the group is dedicated to the destruction of the State of Israel. Armed violence is a part of their struggle. Hamas's military wing was modeled after the Palestinian Fedayeen armed groups that emerged in the 1950s after the creation of Israel.
But with one major difference: those all armed groups were not terrorists, while this one wasn't entirely, and that is recognized and irrefutable fact.
And in 1993, when Israel and the PLO signed the Oslo Accords, Hamas resorted to using suicide bombers. First attacks on Israel using this method were recorded in 1993. If you're wondering why they were so opposed, the explanation is very simple. Terrorists did not want the PLO, which at that time considered itself the only legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, to enter into any peace agreements with the Jews.
In simple terms, Hamas believes that the PLO was acting too softly, and therefore the terrorists would start their struggle in the most simplest and most understandable way: the destruction of Israel, which they saw as the root of all problems of the Palestinian people.
Hamas effectively consolidated its power in the Gaza Strip in 2005, when Israel withdrew its troops and dismantled the settlements. From that moment on, Hamas's adventures in this territory began. The following year, they gained a majority in the legislative bodies and even formed their own government. The turning point was in 2007. After a period of deadly anarchy in Gaza, following the 2006 election victory, Hamas-backed candidates came to power. The terrorists also managed to seize control of the coastal enclave by force.
In Israel, there were fears that such a radical government would gather resources and forces to strike the country and ultimately achieve their terrorist goal of destroying their neighbor. This was no secret. Hamas and its supporters openly declared their intentions. Therefore,
Israel took the next step, the blockade of the Gaza Strip. They restricted the movement of people and goods into and out of Gaza. According to the then government, this was the right decision to prevent Hamas from developing weapons. Whether it worked or not can be judged today by analyzing the events of October 7, 2023.
what became clear and decisive in a short term was the destroyed economy of Gaza and a torrent of accusations that Israel used the tactic of collective punishment.
You know, the emergence of such organizations is a consequence of poverty and hopelessness. Therefore, sooner or later, ordinary people choose either to suffer from the wrongdoers or to become part of them.
I'm not saying that all Palestinians are Hamas, but a significant number supports them. I will provide statistical data at the end of the episode. Now let's continue about Hamas in Gaza.
The first and most important thing they did was to defeat almost all of their political opponents, namely the PLO and Fatah. Hamas launched a large-scale disinformation campaign, claiming that both movements and parties had become corrupt and had done practically nothing for the Palestinian people. This eventually led to a split in the Palestinian independence movement. And when Hamas finally managed to secure their position in the Gaza Strip, they created their own judicial system and authoritarian institutions. This became a big problem because Hamas is not just about the party or its militant wing.
It's also about the police, a network of informers, educational institutions, security services, and so on. They influence all spheres of Palestinian life, and if an ordinary citizen is suspected of collaborating with Israel, it means a death penalty.
In theory, Hamas governs according to the basic law of Palestine based on Sharia, but in practice, they are more brutal. During the early years of Hamas's rule, they closely monitored how women dressed and enforced rules of gender segregation. Hamas militants actively monitor the media and social networks, suppress political opposition and NGOs, aided by their well-structured organization. They have numerous governing bodies that perform political, social, cultural, and military functions. The main governing body is called the Politburo, and its elimination is impossible because it is a government in exile. Below it are various committees responsible for life under Hamas's rule.
For example, under the Politburo, there is an additional government and a special commission that determines the leadership of the Politburo itself, with an unofficial and unknown numbers of members. So, eliminating one person won't solve the issue.
There are two separate governments working in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, a Ministry of Prisoners Affairs, and a commission responsible for diaspora relations around the world. Below them are regional politicians, security forces, courts, and so on. It's a very complicated structure that cannot be eradicated by eliminating one person, even if it is a leader. According to the Council on Foreign Relations, some Hamas leaders are currently in Qatar, some in Iran, and Turkey. One leader, Yahya Sinwar, who is responsible for daily affairs, spent 22 years in an Israeli prison for organizing the kidnapping and murder of 2 Israeli soldiers.
But he and a little over 1,000 other Palestinians were released in 2011 in exchange for one Israeli soldier who was captured by Hamas.
Dozens of countries have recognized Hamas as a terrorist organization. However, some apply this designation only to its military wing. Meanwhile, the UN has not recognized either the party or the military wing as a terrorist group because, besides combat operations, Hamas also provides social services to people in Gaza, such as education and healthcare.
The question arises, if the USA and the world's largest economies recognize Hamas as a terrorist, how do they get funding and the ability to produce weapons?
There is a misconception that Hamas simply stole money from the UN, which funds the PLO and the development of Palestinians in the region. But this is false. For example, The Guardian writes that both Hamas's military wing and the party, along with all their structures, are cut off from official aid provided by the UN, the US, and the European Union.
Their financial influence comes from Palestinian immigrants and private donors in the Persian Gulf. Additionally, they receive significant support from authoritarian regimes opposed to the US.
Previously, aid was also recorded from Islamic charitable organizations. But now, this is not the case, because the US would simply freeze the accounts of any organizations that decided to fund Hamas.
But what they cannot block is cryptocurrency. Before the invasion on October 7, 2023, it was already known that Hamas was collecting donations in crypto.
And the blockade of the Gaza Strip also plays a significant role. And it's not just Israel implementing it, but also Egypt. Back in 2006 and 2007, both countries sealed Gaza's borders. More than 2 million Palestinians live there, reliant solely on international aid. Hamas, of course, found ways to profit from this. For many years after the blockade began, Hamas collected revenue by taxing goods that moved through a complex network of tunnels, bypassing the Egyptian crossing into Gaza. This brought in basic foodstuffs, medicines, and cheap gas for electricity generation, along with building materials, money, and weapons. The blockade effectively became a way for Hamas to make money. For example, in 2013, when the hostile Egyptian president Abdel Fattah el-Sisi came to power, the Egyptian army closed most of the tunnels violating their territory and launched an anti-terrorist campaign on the Sinai Peninsula. Only in 2018 did Egypt allow some commercial goods to be transported into Gaza, but Hamas capitalized on this too. As of 2021, militants were earning over $12 million a month from taxes on Egyptian goods imported into Gaza.
Theoretically, you might wonder, why Egypt blocks the Gaza Strip? Are they fighting against their own people? It indeed looks that way. By Egypt sees Hamas as an extension of the Muslim Brotherhood, a hostile organization.
To give you an idea, even Yasser Arafat said that Hamas does not represent the Palestinian people, but is an Israeli intelligence project aimed solely at discrediting the Palestinians.
Of course, we will never know for sure, at least not anytime soon.
Today, Iran is one of the biggest benefactors for Hamas. It provides funds, weapons, and training. Annually, Hamas alone receives about $100 million from Iran. Since 2002, when Recep Tayyip Erdogan came to power in Turkey, Ankara has repeatedly emphasized its political support for Hamas. The Turkish Cooperation and Coordination Agency is often criticized internationally for facilitating terrorism through its support for Hamas.
And Russia, according to Ukrainian intelligence, has repeatedly supplied weapons to Hamas. Part of this includes trophy small arms that Palestinian terrorists use in their fight against the Israeli Defense Forces.
Russian politicians have frequently met with militant leaders to discuss cooperation, most recently in September 2022, during Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. This raised concerns only from the Ukrainian embassy in Israel.
Overall, Hamas is just a part of a regional alliance that includes Iran, Syria, the Lebanese Hezbollah, and several other terrorist organizations.
Islamic Jihad is the second largest armed group in the region. They often join forces with Hamas to confront the Israeli military. They are the most important member of the Joint Operations Room, which coordinates activities among various armed groups in Gaza. Exact numbers are unclear, but for example, the Israelis claim that Hamas militants could number up to 40,000. They have vehicles, launchers, rockets that fly up to 255 kilometers, small boats, drones, and even combat divers.
And the most frightening thing is that Hamas constantly changes and adapts to what is happening in the world. If earlier they shouted about the death of Israel, but realized that couldn't achieve it, then in 2017, they somewhat softened their demands.
Hamas' political document, which appeared in 2017, declared the following. Recognition of Israel as a state is still not accepted, but Hamas agrees to the creation of a temporary Palestinian state in Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. They refer to the so-called 1967 borders. The document also stated that Hamas fights not against Jews, but against the occupying Zionist aggressors. Israel claimed that Hamas was simply trying to deceive the world.
Finally, some statistics. In June 2023, the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research conducted a study.
The survey showed that in the presidential elections, more than half of the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank would vote for a Hamas candidate over the current president of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas. And by the way, Mahmoud Abbas postponed the presidential elections only because he fears losing them to a Hamas candidate. This means that in the event of a victory, this terrorist organization will become even more entrenched in Gaza and other territories.
And a bit about the West Bank. Palestinians continue to claim that while Hamas
was gaining strength, the Israeli government continued to strengthen Israeli settlements in the area despite Palestinian resistance.
Hamas leaders say that Israeli repressions against militants in the West Bank, continued settlement construction, which the international community considers illegal, thousands of prisoners in Israeli jails, and the ongoing blockade of Gaza pushed them to attack.
Yes, you had that right. Repression against militants. This is not a mistake. The terrorists actually said that condemn repression against terrorists. and they can no longer be stopped.
Because this disinformation machine is moving at breakneck speed. Moreover, they do not acknowledge that during the invasion of Israel on the 7th, they killed civilians. Hamas attacked only settlers living in illegal settlements. These are our legitimate targets. It is important to distinguish settlers from civilians. We deliberately do not target civilians. We have declared that settlers are part of the occupation and part of the Israeli armed forces. They are not civilians.
But killing children and beheading them is hardly justifiable. Is it impossible to call such victims part of the Israeli armed forces?
But the problem is that you can't fight them with violence. Terrorist groups never disappear because terrorism is the oldest form of violence. And this has been proven by terrorist groups in Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, and so on. Western analysts believe that bombing Gaza could provoke a significant attack on Israel from Hezbollah, which would in turn draw in other terrorist groups into the war.
But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Time will tell. Thank you for watching this video to the end.